All right, and I'm sure many of you have been looking forward to this conversation this week after a wild few days around the end of the Winnipeg Jets season. Let's welcome in our good friend Murat from The Athletic. We will certainly get to part 2 of the fan poll, which is now up at The Athletic right now. But first things first, how you doing, Murat? On to the off season. Here we go.
On to the off season, and it's not getting remotely boring anytime soon. I mean, the content is coming. The coaches are not being renewed. We've got some guys to talk about who might be the next head coach of the Winnipeg Jets. We have Mark Scheifele talking about his future in uncertain terms. I know you've touched on that all week. Pierre-Luc Dubois, I mean, he was at a Montreal cafe by evening on Monday after Winnipeg Jets exit interviews went hours late. It's a time in Winnipeg, and this is going to be such a transformative offseason for the Jets.
Well, you know what? Okay, let's just quickly, because I do want to talk about everything we heard from the players and sort of the wrap, but, sort of the news today, and I, heard about this last night, and Elliot Friedman spoke about it this morning on 32 Thoughts, about, some of the names that, are coming out for, potential interviews for the Winnipeg Jets head coaching job. I guess first question, what did you think about the announcement? And I don't even know whether this was announcement. I mean, it was about as couched as you could get, but the coaching staff will have the opportunity to apply for their jobs, but they're basically not coming back, with the exception of Wade Flaherty, which I think to most makes sense considering the relationship he has with Connor Hellebuyck and Eric Comrie. But the two names, and I wouldn't say that it's surprising considering, some old ties to the people running this hockey club, is Scott Arniel, of course, who was the coach of the Manitoba Moose when they went to the Calder Cup finals back in 2009, former head coach of the Columbus Blue Jackets, and a guy that has been on the bench with two pretty successful coaches over the course of the past 10 years with Alain Vigneault and as well as Peter Laviolette right now with the Washington Capitals. And the other name is Randy Carlyle. And Randy Carlyle may be a little bit more of an interesting choice. I mean, certainly very experienced, 2 stints with the Ducks, stint with the Toronto Maple Leafs, a Stanley Cup winning coach, and one that I think many people would qualify as a bit of a hard ass, which has been commented on. First off, your thoughts on the decision to all but announce that they're moving on from this present coaching staff, and what did you think about those two names being floated out by Friedman earlier today?
Well, yeah, I'll start with the guys on their way out. What a strange way to make that kind of announcement. I mean, when have you ever, and I know it's happened every once in a while in NHL history, but the idea of somebody interviewing for their own job, I mean, does Dave Lowry want to head coach the Winnipeg Jets next year? Adam Lowry was talking about how tough that relationship was. They made an arrangement between the two of them not to necessarily speak outside of the rink. That changes the family dynamic a little bit. You've got guys going through a tumultuous season, and they want to be able to shit talk the coach, and not always because the coach is wrong, but because that's a dressing room in the National Hockey League. They're not going to do that in front of an extremely popular teammate like Adam Lowry. Like, they can trust that it's not going to go all the way up, but they're not going to be that rude to a guy that they care about in terms of that sort of stuff as well. That whole dynamic is flawed. And so, no, he's not going to come back. I would be astonished if they interviewed him with any sincerity. And to frame it that way is, I don't know, it just seems like a soft play. And I mean that pejoratively, which I don't often go that way, when I talk about this sort of stuff, right? That seems awkward to me. And then the same thing with the assistants. And I recognize that because you sort of want to leave the door open for that theoretical possibility that the head coach that you bring in assesses the assistants available and actually maybe does want to bring back, say, Matt Prefontaine as well, or something to that effect. I mean, you want to leave that theoretically open, but it's just an awful way, an awfully soft wiggle word political way to say something, which is these guys won't be back. And so I didn't like that at all. In terms of the future, it looks like it's intimately connected to Winnipeg Jets past. Scott Arniel, somebody who I've thought about a little bit as well. In that fan survey that went up this week, one of the options when I ask people, who do you want that next coach to be? a famous NHL coach like, Mike Babcock isn't in the NHL right now for good reason based on what happened in Toronto, to be sure, or perhaps an up-and-comer with no connections to the NHL, or an experienced assistant. And I started that list with Scott Arniel for a reason. And it's because Mark Chipman and True North believe in relationships. They have good relationships with people like Arniel and with Carlisle as well, to be sure, based on history in Winnipeg. Arniel was an IHL Moose, as I recall, as well. I mean, this is something that goes way, way back. And when I talked to Mark Chipman about coaching in October, we talked about Paul Maurice, we talked about Pascal Vincent, we talked about everybody who had come and gone through Winnipeg Jets, Manitoba Moose ranks. And the one thing that he made clear at that point was that he sincerely believed in every single person who came through the door and then exited it, hoping that they would go on to bigger and better things, whether that was Pascal Vincent, whether it was even Claude Noel, whether, at that time, Paul Maurice seemed to have the security, he stepped away. So he's a big believer in the people that's been around. So as much as folks say, hey, Bruce Boudreau in Vancouver, that's an issue right now. That might not happen. What if New York Islanders let Barry Trotz go? Sure. I mean, that's not going to happen. What about all these famous retreads around the NHL who might command, $3 million, $4 million, $5 million per year? I don't think that's the route that's going to happen here. I think it's very realistic. It's very, very realistic for potential options with Jets connections in the past to go. And then Huss, just on Randy Carlisle, the one thing, like, there's lots to love. The hard-ass nature, I think, would be a welcome bit of fun here, to be sure. But that Stanley Cup, to attribute that Stanley Cup when a deep, stacked playoff team got Chris Pronger for free heading into 2007 for Ladislav Smid and Joffrey Lupul, who are depth players on a team that was already an up-and-comer, I mean, that's not a coaching win. That's a coaching facilitation, in my opinion. So as much as the disposition might be welcome, I would be extremely skeptical of a resume that begins with part of a cup-winning team when it's as stacked as the 2007 Anaheim Ducks were.
Well, the interesting thing about Carlisle, and listen, at the end of the day, there's only one team that wins every year. And when you have it on your resume, you have it on your resume. And I'll grant you what you just said. He also came back to the Anaheim Ducks in 16-17 and brought them to the conference finals. Now, I think with all coaches we've seen, maybe in some cities more than Winnipeg, there's the law of diminishing returns that accelerates quicker in other spots. But 3 years later, he was out. But it wasn't like he has just had this 1 year of success. And even in Toronto, listen, that was part of this drought we've talked about for the last 18 years. They weren't able to get over the top, but did bring them to the playoffs. Did have a team that challenged. But I do think that if anything, we're looking at what happened in the second round with Anaheim, with the results that they were to get early on. Because make no mistake about it, whoever comes into this position, Murat, this is not going to be starting from scratch and trying to build something. This is trying to reverse everything that happened this year and get this team back to being a playoff team first and foremost, and one that can compete in the toughest division in the National Hockey League. And I would say the results Carlisle had in round 2 with Anaheim potentially would help them. But to me, every coach will coming in will have, certain things on their resume as far as what their teams did when they were behind the bench. To me, what's most interesting is what type of head coach makes the most sense for this Winnipeg Jets team. And listen, we're going to get into potential changes with this roster. I think we all agree it will look different than it was, at the end of the Seattle Kraken game on Sunday afternoon. But I'm interested in your thoughts on, as far as qualities of a head coach, what you would be looking at in a guy that can come in, fit in well, and get the most out of the roster that will be presented to him when they drop the puck in October.
Yeah, I can put together a bit of a mental checklist, and it's possible that Randy Carlisle fits those things, to be clear. The current situation in Winnipeg, clearly there's some locker room strife. The number one issue that we've heard repeated throughout the season is the A word, accountability. Winnipeg has not necessarily felt. The players want to be held accountable. You heard Paul Stastny say that, and certainly many players have voiced that in various ways over the course of the season. They know when players who don't commit to defense get big minutes. They know when shifts go too long. They know. And despite the rosy attempt at the first half of the season, media-wise or what have you, they know that things were missing on that front. So, okay, you have the pieces, you have a lot of talent, even if you're forced into trading Mark Scheifele, which isn't a guarantee, but seems likely. You're bringing talent back. This isn't for a pure future situation. So there's a lot of good things. So the number one thing that the Winnipeg Jets head coach has to be able to do is generate buy-in while maintaining accountability to performance. If that can be done with, a player's coach mentality, somebody who's going to win over the personalities of the room, great. If that needs to be done via the hard-ass old school methods, well, that's good too, as long as the results are there. The issue with that, with Winnipeg, that I would see is that we've seen such long shelf lives for coaches and staff over the course of Winnipeg Jets history. That's a Mark Chipman stable. He believes in that. So are you going to have, how are those two philosophies going to conflict? The idea that somebody's going to be a hard ass, do what he needs to do, maybe even definitely piss a lot of guys off, change minutes arrangements, hold people accountable to new standards, better standards, all of that sort of stuff, and then put together another 8 years behind the bench. I don't think that that's necessarily, I think there's some conflict there. But if Winnipeg's willing to wear a slightly shorter term and have a guy come in and be that kind of hard ass, by all means, to be sure. But like I say, number one, accountability to performance with buy-in. These guys can't hate this guy. They have to be able to respect them. So, probably that means a veteran and a veteran with ties to the organization is possible.
Well, buy-in is a key word because it was quite obvious that the Winnipeg Jets didn't have complete buy-in right now. And, we'd heard it over and over from a number of players through the last couple of weeks of the season, and it came out loud and clear. I know you were covering the team and covering the game on Sunday as well as Monday. Before we get to Mark Scheifele and what he had to say, what did you think about, a number of the comments that we maybe discussed a little bit last week, but there were more coming through afterwards, right up until Paul Stastny spoke with, and the more I think about this, I've probably listened to it 30 times. Maybe the most damning indictment of teammates from a veteran player, a respected veteran player that I can ever remember at the end of the season. We'll get to Scheifele in a minute, but everything else that you were hearing from the rest of the rank and file of the Winnipeg Jets, Murat.
Paul Stastny, what a guy, honestly. The idea of him re-signing last summer, the value they got from that. This is a guy that scored the game-winning goal in Game 7 against the Nashville Predators to take Winnipeg the furthest that the Jets have ever got. He's the one center with whom Laine and Ehlers, as just young pups in the NHL, had positive possession metrics. They had all kinds of offense, all of that stuff. Then he comes back. Last year, he calls out the team for cheating, having cheat in its game, which was a necessary thing to say, and probably in a lot of ways the beginning of this discourse becoming truly public. And then this year, all the different moments where he said things like this, even leading up to those comments. And I'll get into those comments, but the other thing that you can say about Paul Stastny is there is zero cheat in his game, right? So respected veteran to be sure, family dynasty in the NHL to be sure, been around locker rooms forever, all of those things, all of those on-ice accomplishments I just mentioned, well over 1,000 games as well, hit 800 points. But maybe the best thing he ever does for the Winnipeg Jets organization is to speak those truths as plainly as he did on Sunday. I thought that was remarkable. I mean, not just to say what he said, but every detail of that. Blake Wheeler had already given me a good answer. I was asking Blake Wheeler about the team's defensive issues. When was the last time you heard Blake Wheeler say the team's 200-foot commitment wasn't there? I thought that was a nice moment for the captain for a beat there. And so the door to a little bit of candor was open. But then Stastny comes in with the Kanye West, hold on, I'm going to let you finish kind of deal. I'm just going to, hold on, I got to jump in. And then he says what he said. Then he says that. This is a guy with nothing to lose, with all the respect in the world, who might sign in Winnipeg this summer if they can arrange it, but I haven't tended to expect that to be the case. I still don't think that's necessarily the play. So he gets to say whatever he wants. And the thing that he wants to say is that it's clear Winnipeg's players sometimes treat each other without respect, with too much focus on individual play. that's the ultimate non-hockey attitude, right? It's about the jersey, like it's about the crest on the chest and not the name on the back. Or am I right? Like, so that was damning. And the fact, but the fact is though, Huss, like, this is me telling a story of that moment. We saw that. And if we saw players cheat, if players half-assed defensive back checking, play wishful defense, hoping like a peewee player that the puck's going to bounce in the right direction and go the other way so you can pad your stats. I mean, we saw that all season. And if we see that, the players have seen it and understand it better. So, we talk about guys wanting to feel accountable, wanting to be held to high standards. Like, this was somebody's opportunity to speak his mind to the lot of us, to the world at large. And that's significant. And it speaks to the fact that real, major, substantive change has to happen in Winnipeg because things have gone truly sour.
It did seem like he amplified and made it abundantly clear that everything that we had heard from a number one of those players that had been bubbling under the surface not only was there, but was even, he amplified it, as I said, and made it abundantly clear for anyone that maybe hadn't been paying attention what was happening and needed to be said. And maybe it was the freedom of being an unrestricted free agent, potentially being back. But to be honest, and maybe this is just my perspective on this, especially, and we'll get to Scheifele and the potential that he's not a Winnipeg Jet next season. I think that it would have been so easy for a guy that UFA to not even do the media at the end of the year. Just come in and just say, yeah, Blake, you're the captain, take it over. It was obvious it was important to him to say that. As I said, the question wasn't even to Blake Wheeler. It was to Blake Wheeler. He popped in and said, let me take that one and drop that bomb. So I don't know where I'm sitting right now. I think it's maybe more important than ever to do what they can do to get Paul Stastny back. Never mind the fact that you might need to have Paul Stastny moving back into the middle, depending on what happens with the potential Scheifele trade. But I mean, I've referred to him as the conscience of this team for a long time. If there was any doubt about that, we got it on Sunday. And I would argue that Paul Stastny's importance to this organization is even higher today than it may have been at any point in his term or his two terms of duty here in the Peg.
I mean, yes, right? Like, astonishingly, yes. At this stage, at 36 years old, at a time that, even when Winnipeg acquired him from Vegas, there was questions that has his offense fallen off because he'd had some bad percentage runs the last year. All of these things. But yeah, absolutely. And man, if you're Paul Stastny at this stage, probably you've made a fair bit of money. It's probably about winning. It's probably about culture. Maybe not every team is calling, but make no mistake, the guy had a good year. He's into the 40-something points, providing sound defense, a defensive conscience for other players. You can watch him in his own zone. He's got it. You can watch him read the chemistry of a guy like Nikolai Ehlers. They have it. There is no cheat in his game, which stood out at times during the Mark Scheifele flyby era, right? There's contrast on the very same shift. And to think, like, I think of Paul Stastny, you say conscience of the team. That's, yeah, I like that. I think Switzerland as well, like, in the sense that there's no real conflict around Paul Stastny. I mean, the veterans will get along with him. The young players will respect and admire him. He can speak to difficult issues with calm, with experience, and all of those sorts of things. Man, and if you need another center, absolutely. It's astonishing to me that the Jets didn't run him in the middle this season, or at least try that a little bit more than they did. I say astonishing. It's not, actually, because I think he helped Mark Scheifele out quite a bit in that regard. All to say, I haven't tended to think that he's going to re-sign here. I have tended to think that he's on his way out, that Winnipeg maybe should have traded for assets. But then to hear him speak and reflect on just how important he could be moving forward, you'd understand why Kevin Cheveldayoff says he'd love to have him back. You may even understand why he kept him around at the expense of assets, because what is a second-round pick or a third-round pick or whatever it's going to be next to that role that he can play on that team as a leader with that respect and with that honesty?
No, there's no doubt about it. And I mean, and I guess this takes us to Mark Scheifele in that, and listen, we'll get to the comments in a second, but I think a big part of what has kind of transpired has been over the past month or so has been sort of a separation, because let's face it, for a long time, the leadership group, if you will, the guys that this team was all about, that everything seemed to be molded around and for, was Blake Wheeler and Mark Scheifele. And one of the things that Dave Lowry did was split those guys up. And we've talked about this before. I think Wheeler sort of thrived in that. I mean, he played some of his best hockey down the stretch. And even himself said it was really disappointing, even that they weren't going to the playoffs, but he didn't have a few more games to play with Nikolai Ehlers and Paul Stastny, with the fun that they were having on the ice and the connection that they were having. So maybe that was calculated as well, something that needed to happen, but maybe separating those two, because for a long time, when you talked about the Winnipeg Jets, you talked about Wheeler and Scheifele and then everybody else. But there's been a lot of talk about Mark. We've spent many, many hours on this program discussing what's happened to his game, where he is as a leader of this hockey club. And it became evident to me throughout the last couple weeks of what we were hearing from the players, that, everything that I think we were seeing with our eyes and taking from the demeanor, both on and off the ice, that something was wrong, was clear, especially when Paul Stastny spoke. But then Mark Scheifele came up, and the difference from what we heard from that player as opposed to pretty much every other member of the team was stunning in a lot of ways. Listen, I've talked a lot about this over the last couple of days. You were there. What was your immediate reaction to what you heard from Mark Scheifele, and what does this mean going forward for the Jets, and a guy that everyone thought was going to be the next captain, would be a Jet for life?
I mean, I'll tell you the absolute truth. When highly respected colleague Scott Billick asked the question, how do you see your future? I thought to myself, this is going to be a one and done. This is going to be one sentence. We're on the way out. I, in that exact beat, didn't even understand the importance of the question, to tell you the truth. I thought that we were so headed for a vanilla, typical response that I was just getting ready for the next beat. But then Mark Scheifele says what he says, and he acknowledges that he wants to take a break and look and see. So let me divide this into two things. If you take the literal value of the words, if you take the message and you just divorce it from the year, what he essentially said is, I have to step back and think about things and then think about my future. I have a decision to make. And to tell you the truth, that in and of itself, not that stunning. There's part of it that's stunning, the fact that he has a contract that holds him until 2024, 2 seasons left. But when Pierre-Luc Dubois said the same thing in more self-aware words the previous week, I thought to myself, yeah, Winnipeg is in tumult right now. There's an issue in Winnipeg right now. And I'd want to know who the head coach was. I'd want to know what the roster looked like before signing a long-term deal like Pierre-Luc Dubois might. Or I think he's probably looking at 1 year before things are said and done. So I thought that was a reasonable take from Dubois. Why should I criticize it when it comes from Scheifele? And the big difference, I think, there are two, are that 2024, that's 2 years away, Scheifele's under contract. So the idea that he has a decision to make, I mean, that speaks to relationships that are pretty far gone. Maybe not fixable, like maybe they are fixable. I've seen a lot of, in the course of NHL watching, I mean, conflict does heal sometimes. That is surprising. If Mike Comrie can go back to Edmonton after all the tumult that surrounded his trading away, look up the Mike Comrie Edmonton saga and be happy, any relationship can be fixed. That's an aside. But it speaks to a broken relationship or a breaking relationship. That's a significant thing. And the fact that Mark Scheifele put so many I's and me's into that answer, that's where you can start to nitpick, because what that implies is that he sees himself as separate from the problem. The problem must be solved, and then he'll make his decision. That's what if you want to go English essay on that response, if you want to write it out, read all the I's and me's, and separate it from the lack of we or team thinking, it's this sense that he is separate from what is going wrong in Winnipeg. And I think if you watch this brilliant, gifted, offensive wizard play, create chances for himself and for his teammates, score the goal like he did coast to coast against Colorado, the 2018 playoffs where every time he was on the ice, he was a threat to score, and you contrast it to the moments where he does not put in the effort, it does speak to a player who is part of the issue in Winnipeg, and the inability to frame it as such. At least say we will all be looking in the mirror, that kind of stuff that you heard from Neil Pionk and others. I mean, if that's truly how he feels, there's a tremendous amount of self-reflection that this amazing hockey player still needs to go through. And I think it's possible. I mean, like at 29 years old, young men go through transformations. They do. They can. Maybe a change of scenery is what's necessary to spark that reflection, to spark the willingness to think of himself as part of what's going wrong as opposed to separate from it. Or, of course, maybe his private thinking is different from what he said publicly. But that's a really troubling perspective if we can take it at the literal value of all of those I's and me's.
Well, and it would be troubling for any player on the roster. I mean, it would be troubling if it was, a third line player or your fifth or sixth defenseman. But to me, it's exponentially more concerning when it's a player in Mark Scheifele that has been I talked about this yesterday on the program. His thoughts, and of course, I mean, the timing of Cheveldayoff speaking before the exit interview and not really able to find out what came out of that, I'm sure was frustrating to everyone, and I'm sure was by design. But when he says, I'm going to need to hear some things, I ask you this: what more could any organization give Mark Scheifele than he hasn't already been given here in Winnipeg? I mean, he has been the cornerstone. So many of his flaws, so many of the things that have obviously irked all of his teammates had been overlooked for years, had been tolerated, to be honest, had been, you take the bad with the good. And it's obviously rankled so many other players on this team. Like, I'm not sure if he pays much attention to what the other players had been saying over the couple weeks. But I kind of took that maybe he had, because this was, everyone else had said their piece, and his decision was, okay, obviously I'm on the outs. And, listen, I mean, his first comment to me, Murat, was a sales pitch to 31 other general managers in the National Hockey League, to be perfectly honest, talking about how he likes his game, how he's looking forward to next season, how he's in the prime of his career, all of that. And I'd said for a while that regardless of whether you think that the Jets should or should not be considering trading Mark Scheifele if this is an issue, looking at his season this year with the ups and the downs and the lack of engagement at times, I mean, I was the first one to say, I'm not sure there's a player in the league that could use a change of scenery more than Mark. And to me, it came all out at one point where we're hearing some honest self-reflection from so many other players. And it was a complete lack of self-awareness and the A word, accountability. There was none of it there. And for a guy that had been, leading the team at ice time, leading the team in everything all along, or a team like this, to have none of that there, I think, well, honestly, all it did was echo everything we'd heard from every other member of the Winnipeg Jets up until he stepped in front of that microphone.
Yeah, I mean, it stood out by its contrast. It absolutely did. I mean, to have Blake Wheeler and Paul Stastny say what they said, and then have Mark Scheifele come up and say that right after that, I agree with you. That's a stark contrast. I think in Winnipeg, from a perspective sense, outscoring his defensive issues was always kind of the golden ticket. The thought that he could take over games on the offensive side of things, Winnipeg could win. The backing he would have had from Paul Maurice, the famous statue quote, which may go down as one of the most haunting things Paul Maurice has ever said. It's this sense, I guess, how do I say this? That if you outscore, the idea of giving Mark Scheifele 20 plus minutes every single night, top power play, top 5-on-5 center, never thinking that Pierre-Luc Dubois should play more, all of those sorts of things, it makes sense when he's outscoring his problems. Kyle Connor, for example, I think gets lost in his defensive zone sometimes. His metrics defensively, pretty poor. Great stick, great offensive mind, great forechecker in some capacities, but some of the same defensive issues. It just kind of looks like he's trying and maybe a little bit lost sometimes. You can find clips where he looks unsure, and I think a lot of people would look unsure in Winnipeg's defensive schemes this year. But the metrics are similar between those guys. But Kyle Connor outscored his issues, scored 93 points, preached accountability, did all of those things. So the perception is a lot more in Kyle Connor's favor. And I think that he's saying and doing the right things in those ways where you don't, where in Mark Scheifele's case, you've seen some sulk, you've seen some attitude that you would question, you would absolutely question. And I think that's fair. And now that he was like really rocked by percentages, like all those shots that he missed, he skied, he was robbed on early in the season. I mean, he had a pretty poor by Mark Scheifele standards point total heading into the All-Star break, came out of it, exploded, got all the bounces back and then some. And all of a sudden he finishes the year above a point per game. I think had he been a point per game or above it all season long, there would have been a little bit less stuff around it. But still, like you say, all of that is kind of noise, because what more could the Jets have offered? I mean, if you look at the Toronto Maple Leafs and Tampa Bay Lightning, I don't think a single forward played more than 20 minutes. I don't think a single forward played, maybe one per team played less than 10 in game one of that series. And you can go on, Carolina, Boston, etc. You can look at these playoff teams and how they manage their minutes. I think other teams look at the Winnipeg Jets and they think to themselves, those guys are going to get tired and they're not going to back check well enough. So we can play our stars against them and it's going to be fine, no matter how gifted that Mark Scheifele, the top center, is.
Yeah. If I had just seen a quote from a player, from what had been said, or maybe had heard and didn't know who it was, and if it was, say, I could understand Nikolai Ehlers saying something like that. If he was that type of a player and he was in that mood, saying, you know what, I need to figure out where this team is going forward because I have done all this and I'm never on the top power play and I haven't been on the top line, I would almost have time for that. But when like anyone that's paid attention knows that, I mean, I'm not sure what more this team could have done or given Mark Scheifele throughout the entire stretch of his term here, but especially this season. And to be where we are, it's interesting. Where do you think this leaves Blake Wheeler right now?
On something that could resemble an island without a great deal of self-reflection on his part as well. And, we spend so much time talking about Scheifele. I think I do it because I see greatness and the potential for greatness as opposed to the goodness, which we've seen. I think that's why I spend so much time on Scheifele. He could be more than what we see with a different sort of perspective and with self-reflection. I think he has access to a lot more. And I hope I show empathy for that. I feel like I rant sometimes. I hope that there's empathy for that because greatness is available to him. Without him, Blake Wheeler does become something of an island, especially if Paul Stastny is not retained. Those two have been the leadership group with, Dustin Byfuglien, now Josh Morrissey, et cetera. I think those two have been the real drivers in a lot of ways. Wheeler's notes about youth can't go unnoticed by the 25-year-olds, 26-year-olds who are driving results. I guarantee you that there are members of the Winnipeg Jets who actively think to themselves, Nikolai Ehlers should play more than Blake Wheeler does. Like it would be unfathomable for me to think that players have watched what has happened and not come to their own conclusions about who are the drivers for results on that team. Unfathomable. So what can Blake Wheeler do? Because we have some moments of great leadership. That hug he gives Josh Morrissey at a crucial moment for him. There are good things that he does. He's not a guy that should be retiring. He's a middle six player. He can still put up points. He's added some things to his game in terms of how he cuts into the middle a lot more slowly than he used to. There's a player there and a person there who can be part of a winning hockey club. But I think that the tension around him, the spitting nails, as he says that he does, the intensity, all of those sorts of things, I think that it's going to be so hard for him. It would be such a challenge to look at yourself as the number one guy for so long, wear the captaincy for so long, be the number one right winger for so long, watch the steady incline, right? Because he came into the league slowly. He was on a deep Boston Bruins team. He took till his mid-20s before he was getting real primo minutes. It took until his 30s when the power play helped him hit back-to-back 91-point seasons. Everything has gone up and up and up. And to watch his teammates go through the modern version, which is 25-year-old players are the drivers. Like Blake Wheeler does not help the Jets win more than Nikolai Ehlers or Kyle Connor or Pierre-Luc Dubois does. And then willfully say, okay, like I'm one of the most competitive people ever. I spit nails often. This is Blake Wheeler type. He says that he spits nails. He's tough to be around sometimes. and then look in the mirror and say, okay, you know what? I'm going to step back and I'm going to be let's really push for the second line or third line, whatever helps the team win. That's got to be tough. And then to hold back that competitive spirit when things aren't going wrong and he has his own ideas. I mean, just from a human being perspective, the ability to make that transition would be so remarkable. And again, Blake Wheeler may have access to it. That's a challenge. I'm trying to express empathy again because, I mean, he was such an underrated elite player forever, right? Like, he'll have specific views about what it means to be a successful NHL player, what that path should look like, all those sorts of things. But at this stage, the reality is the Winnipeg Jets would go further with fewer minutes from the guy and with less of himself being the focal point of the leadership, in my opinion. And if he can integrate himself into this new wave, the Kyle Connor that's talking about accountability, the Nikolai Ehlers, et cetera, all the way down the line, well, then you've got something good. You've got Joe Thornton playing on the third line and eventually towards 40 years old playing on the fourth, all those sorts of things. There's good available to the Jets, but that transition seems tough. I think he'll be facing just as much self-reflection this summer as a guy in Scheifele's shoes should.
Yeah, no, and I do believe, I think there is the possibility that Wheeler can be here and be part of the solution moving forward, assuming that Scheifele is gone. But it will be a different arrangement, and it will take many of the things that you just mentioned. Murat from The Athletic is with us. Murat, I knew we'd get going on a bunch of these topics coming out of the last season, but for Athletic subscribers, if they go to the site, they'll see part 2 of the Jets fan survey. Just quickly before we go, why don't you tease the piece a little bit and maybe anything that really surprised you coming out of it, or what were the big takeaways were from Winnipeg Jets fans after a disappointing season? I know we've heard from a lot of them, both in your inbox and here on Winnipeg Sports Talk.
Yeah, it's just so good to give people a voice to really to speak out and to give their opinions on what went wrong, what the team should do, who you want as coach, what the next generation of Jets should look like. And, I broke it into 2 pieces because there was so much heat and so much fury. And I asked so many questions too. And I wanted to give time to really explore every answer. I would say part 2, the one that went live just yesterday, it's the one where fans really make decisions and were challenged. And I think some of the more difficult conversations happened in terms of what didn't go right. What do you believe about Jets leadership? What do you believe about coaching? Who should be the next coach? I would say the fun surprise, though, because one of the choices was picking next year's roster. Who are your top 6 defensemen going into next season? Josh Morrissey was number 1 with a bullet. And the second player on that list was a stunner to me. I can't think of, and this should be season over season, things change. People have improvements and all of that sort of stuff. Your number 2 defenseman, it wasn't Neil Pionk. It wasn't Dylan DeMello. It wasn't one of the veterans. It wasn't Ville Heinola or Logan Stanley. It was Dylan Samberg. And I think that, I've ranted a lot, but if we could just end that on a bright note, the season that young man has had after a tough start has really done a lot to sort of cement some hope and some positivity in the minds of Jets fans. And we get into the hope and we get into the positivity. And Dylan Samberg, whose AHL playoffs will start this week, are a huge, huge part of that as well.
Yeah, well, never a dull moment around here, folks. Get to The Athletic. It is a really interesting piece to hear from all of you, compiled in a way that only Murat can do it. And we'll look forward to catching up next week. I'll say one thing about this. Usually you get into the off season and things quiet down a little bit. That ain't happening this year in Winnipeg with this hockey club. But Murat, thanks so much for doing this. Always a pleasure having you on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.